Great.
Start the recording. There it goes. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. Just a quick introduction. Manesh is a neuroscience PhD candidate at McGill University, conducting brain imaging research related to psychedelics and the default mode network at the Montreal Neurological Institute. He also hosts the channel The Psychedelic Scientist on YouTube, where he talks about neuroscience and psychedelics deeply, but to a wide audience. So thank you, Manesh, for coming. I leave the floor to you.
Awesome. My pleasure. Yeah, happy to be sharing some of this stuff with you guys. So as you can see, I'm going to be talking a bit about psychedelic neuroscience, as well as so-called ego dissolution and mystical experiences from a scientific perspective in terms of what we've been studying or what has been studied around the world so far. So first, as like an introduction, just to say that when I say psychedelics, I'm referring to the so-called classical psychedelics, which includes LSD, psilocybin, which is like magic mushrooms, DMT/ayahuasca, and mescaline. And the thing that joins these and makes them all similar is that they work mainly at the serotonin 2A receptor, which is a particular receptor in your brain. And here's a little map of your brain, of a brain, and showing where these receptors are located. So in the red are higher density regions, and I'm not sure people's background in neuroscience, but these regions are overlapping with the so-called default mode network, which is a network often talked about in psychedelics, and is some of the most interconnected regions of the brain. So they seem to work via targeting this receptor that's located in the brain regions which have the most influence in terms of the entire brain's functioning. And so just to give an overview of psychedelic brain effects before jumping into the ego dissolution stuff. So something that happens when you activate these receptors, so again, in these red areas where they're located, when you activate them, what that does to brain cells or neurons is it makes them more excitable, which means they're more likely to activate. And it's kind of shown here in the figure as well, how they start to spike once they receive the psychedelic drug. And what this does is when they get more excitable, it means that there's more activity and it's more entropic. And what entropic basically means is it's more unpredictable. It's kind of firing in a very kind of relatively disorganized and unpredictable way, and presumably processing information differently than it was before. And so it increases the excitability of these regions that are very interconnected in the brain. And what this does is it actually seems to make the whole brain more integrated, which you can show in these two circles here with the connections, with placebo, and then this one with psilocybin, in this case, magic mushrooms. You can see there's a lot more connections. And an important thing to recognize about these connections is that they're distant. And what I mean by that is if you look here, there's different colors around the circle here, and each color represents a different network. So instead of these connections being inside of a network, like very small, there's a couple of them, like in the yellow one here, for example, they're mostly going across networks. And what this means is that these different networks are less distinct from each other. They're becoming integrated and blurred together to a greater degree. And so, psychedelics seem to make the whole brain more integrated in this sense. And also what they do, once it's more integrated, the brain is also more dynamic and entropic as a whole. What this means is that the brain is entering into a greater number of states. One way to visualize this is if you look here, this is two regions, the hippocampus and anterior cingulate, and these are potential ways they can connect. And this is actually the connections that they found in placebo. As you can see, these regions can interact in different ways. And then this is with psilocybin. And this is what I mean by, this is like a small model of what I mean by the greater number of brain states. Now there's more ways that they're interconnecting. And if you scale this up to, let's say, 400 regions in the brain, you could see how complex it gets. And the brain is able to enter into many different more states. And so we can say that psychedelics increase the excitability and activity of neuron populations, so groups of a few 100,000 or million neurons at a time. And these, since they're located in these very central regions, make the entire brain more integrated and more dynamic. as well as in other ways to say these things is more unpredictable and complex. So that's like a general account of how psychedelics affect the brain. Obviously, there's a lot more detail, but that's a very high-level view. And then so let's move into ego dissolution and mystical experiences, which will be the focus of this talk. So what is ego dissolution? And admittedly, it's still a pretty vaguely defined scientific construct. In an influential paper, Robin Carhart-Harris and Matthew Knorr, two leading psychedelic researchers from the UK, described it as a reduction in the normally well-circumscribed experience of self, which is related to feelings of increased unity with others and one's surroundings. You know, from this alone, it's kind of vague. It's okay. So what is our normally well-circumscribed sense of self? What is our self to begin with? And, you know, philosophers have a lot of fun with this. And here's a line from a very influential philosopher, Galen Strawson. And he's just listing, he's showing how ridiculous it is to just refer to the self as if it's one thing. He describes all the different types of self he's come across in research and in, you know, the philosophy literature. There's like the cognitive self, conceptual self, embodied self, existential self, philosophical self, private self, you know, the social self, verbal self. There's so many of them, and that's, you know, the word self is like a super vague concept, similar to consciousness or the word God, or, you know, these concepts that everyone has their own understanding of, and therefore it makes it hard to communicate and talk about it. So we need to recognize how, you know, vaguely defined and ambiguously defined the ego dissolution is a lot of the time. And just to dive more into it, into this question of what exactly is the self or ego? What is it that's being dissolved? And so research has kind of suggested it might be two main components. It might have two main components. The first is what philosophers call the minimal or embodied self. So this is our first-person perspective based in our body. It's our sense of I'm located here, I end where my skin ends, and who I am is this body, and that's my window into the world. And so that's like a more fundamental sense of selfhood that differentiates you from your environment. You're like, I'm here, this is my body. And then over and above that, we have something more, because we're not just a body, we're also a person, quote unquote. And what that means is we have an identity. We have a set of beliefs, characteristics, memories of who we were before, our goals and plans of who we're going to be in the future. So you could say that's another layer on our sense of self. Because not only are we a body, but we're a person with these characteristics, etc. And that's what researchers call the narrative or autobiographical self. And in a paper I wrote, you know, a few years ago, we kind of broke this down into a bit more detail, and you could say, you know, the embodied sense of self, rooted in the body, is related to awareness of our body boundaries, feeling that we own our body's location in space, and our conception or representation of our body as a whole, as well as our autobiographical or narrative self. And also the extent to which we take ownership of our thoughts. We say, oh, this thought is me, it's my thought, as opposed to just a thought that's happening, or, you know, a thought that was implanted externally or something like this. So these are all aspects of self-experience which seem to be able to be altered by psychedelics. And so we'll remember that there's the bodied self and then the narrative self. And so the idea is that ego dissolution, as we commonly refer to it, may refer to both these things, being dissolved or altered. So, you know, in terms of research, how is ego dissolution measured? Initially, it was measured in terms of one question, just, you know, rate from 1 to 7, how much this term was true for you. I experienced a disintegration of myself or ego. And remember how ambiguous and ill-defined this is, so it's kind of a very initial first step into trying to measure it. And then, you know, more recently, in like 2016, it was a more formal questionnaire proposed where there's a number of different questions, and they collected a lot of data to find out this is like a valid, psychometrically valid questionnaire that is differentiated from other aspects of the psychedelic experience and is reliable across participants. So it's just more questions. I felt that one with the universe, union with others, decrease in self-importance, all notion of self and identity dissolved away, So this is a bit more, you could say, sophisticated than having just one question. But still, there's a lot of ambiguity here in terms of self. They even put it in quotes, or ego. And for example, you give this to 100 people, chances are a lot of people are going to be answering it differently based on their own understanding of what it means. So I think in the future, we really need to come to more refined measures of ego dissolution, which point out and perhaps differentiate what I mentioned before, which is changes to our body awareness versus our narrative conceptual self. But this has yet to be done. It just shows how early we are in a lot of this research. But that said, taking this measurement of ego dissolution into account, what does the research say about how it relates to the brain? And so before I dive into that, I want to acknowledge that a lot of people link it to the so-called default mode network, which is a network of distributed brain regions that have previously been implicated in processes related to our sense of self, and also stuff like mind wandering, daydreaming, thinking about the thoughts and beliefs of other people, imagination and different types of memory, and all sorts of processes like these. So people have said and popularized the idea that if you disintegrate your default mode network, that's equivalent to the dissolution of your ego. However, what we'll see is that this is not really reliably the case, and it's a lot more nuanced than that. So with that in mind, I like to push back against the narrative that the default mode network is equivalent to the ego, and that dissolving it or disintegrating it dissolves the ego. Again, it's more complex, and the research does not reliably show the default mode network as a whole is disintegrating when you have ego dissolution experiences. And you'll see that in a moment here. So let's go into it. What are some of the brain correlates of ego dissolution found to date? And before I dive into this, I should say all these results are very preliminary because sample sizes have been very small in these studies, usually on the order of 15 people, 15 to maybe 30 people. When, there's a lot of research, statistical research showing that in order to have reliable correlations between brain and behavior, you need at least 50 and ideally above 100 subjects. So 15 to 30, this really doesn't make the cut, and results with that many people have to be taken with a grain of salt. That said, here's what we've found so far. So with psilocybin, one finding has been reduced parahippocampus and hippocampus to cortex connectivity. So, parahippocampus and hippocampus are two core memory regions to the brain. So basically, the more people have ego dissolution, the more these memory regions are disconnected from the cortex, so the more advanced part of the brain, suggesting something related to a disconnection of memory or information that's stored in our hippocampus or related to our hippocampus. And then also decreased glutamate levels in hippocampus. So glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, meaning that more glutamate leads to more activity. So reduced glutamate in the hippocampus means activity there is being lowered or modulated in some way such that glutamate is lowered in that area. But again, it's implicating a core memory region. And keep in mind, this is not corresponding to the whole default mode network, as is often talked about. The hippocampus and parahippocampus are in the default mode network, but the default mode network is much more than that as well. You also got another finding related to the so-called posterior cingulate cortex, and showing that a reduction in alpha brain rhythms is also associated with ego dissolution. What's interesting is that this region is very connected to the hippocampus and parahippocampus, and is one of the ways that the hippocampus shares its memory information with the rest of the brain. And reduced alpha power or alpha rhythms suggests that the neurons within this region are becoming disorganized. So again, there seems to be also a specific disruption or change in the way that memory information is distributed in the brain. And then outside of the default mode network, a network called the salience network. The disintegration of it is correlated with the ego dissolution. And this network involves an interesting region called the insula. And the insula is involved in a number of things, but it's involved in our sense of self-awareness and awareness of our body, of kind of feelings and sensations in our body, and interoception, as it's called, is very much linked to this network. So what's interesting is, like, whereas these first three relate to memory regions, potentially related to the narrative self I mentioned earlier, this one might be related to the embodied self and our sense of feeling like we're in this body and we have this body. And another finding they found was the two hemispheres or sides of our brains, when they communicate less with each other, then people have more ego dissolution. Suggesting, even beyond networks, these broad whole brain level changes also seem to be at play here. So that's with psilocybin. So you get this interesting mix of memory versus body-related regions. And with LSD, you actually get the reduction and integration of the entire default mode network actually does correlate with ego dissolution. It's barely statistically significant. And again, it's preliminary, but it suggests that there could be something there in terms of default mode network. And again, you get this parahippocampus region coming again, and its connection to the retrosplenial cortex, which is right next to the posterior cingulate, and again is involved in distributing memory information to the rest of the brain. So again, these memory regions in the so-called medial temporal lobe of the brain keep coming up. And then here's the insula again, which is the core region of the salience network with psilocybin, and also another region called the temporoparietal junction. When I say global connectivity here, it means how connected they are to the rest of the brain. So when the insula, this body sensation and self-awareness region, becomes more connected with the rest of the brain, you get more ego dissolution effects. And this other region, the temporoparietal junction, is actually also involved in our body representation, but actually it computes, in a sense, our body's location in space. So the spatial location of your body is related to this region. As an interesting fact about this region, if you stimulate it with magnetic or electric impulses, you can actually induce out-of-body experiences because you're disrupting the way your brain is integrating information to make you feel like you're located at this place in space in your body. So again, there seems to be a kind of implication of memory-related regions and bodily related regions. This is what I have here. So overall conclusions on ego dissolution so far is that it's not the default mode network as a whole, but it seems to be specifically memory regions such as the hippocampus and parahippocampus in the medial temporal lobes playing an important role. And also these interesting regions in bodily self-awareness and location in space. So this really seems to support what I was mentioning before of the philosophy distinction between the narrative self and the embodied self. So that's basically what we know so far about how ego dissolution works in the brain. And now let's pivot a bit into ego dissolution and mystical experiences. So ego dissolution, abbreviated as ED here, and related feelings of unity, of oneness, are a core component of so-called mystical experiences. And the way that mystical experiences have been characterized scientifically has been highly influenced by the philosopher Walter Stacey in his book in 1960, I believe, called, I want to say, Religion and Mystical Experience or something like this. And basically, he looked at a lot of literature from various religious and spiritual and mystical traditions and found 9 aspects or 9 components or 9 types of experiences that are common across the experiences they describe. One is unity, which is feeling of oneness with the universe or all things, and relates to ego dissolution as we've been talking about it. Also, a feeling of insight into ultimate reality, feeling like this is it, I now understand the meaning of everything, and feeling like you've obtained insight into something that's more real than your usual everyday life. And a feeling of transcending space and time. So now you have no sense of being situated in a particular space, place and time, and your spatial location is also blurred. You're kind of blurring and merging with everything around you. Sense of encountering something sacred. Also feeling a very strong positive mood or bliss or euphoria. And also finding that your experience, it cannot be explained in terms of logic and is very paradoxical. You might feel like you're everything, but you're emptiness at the same time. Feel like you're everywhere but nowhere, and etc. Like you're nobody, but you're everything. These kinds of things, and things are true and false at the same time. And ineffability. It's very hard to communicate, if not impossible, to communicate what exactly is going on for you. And transiency, it's temporary. It lasts for a certain period of time, then goes away. And lastly, it results in positive changes in people. So these are the 9 things that come together in what we call mystical experiences. This is a lot, I know, but we don't need to go through all of it. So this is like the so-called mystical experiences questionnaire developed at Johns Hopkins University. And it's just how they measure a mystical experience. So it pulls from that list that I mentioned before, and it focuses on 4 main factors, which are from the list from before. And these are just questions you rate from 1 to 7 how much you experience them. So stuff like, awareness of the life for living presence in all things, gain of insightful knowledge, experience at an intuitive level, experience of pure being and pure awareness, sense of reverence, loss of your usual sense of time, and so on. So people will rate these, and if you get a certain score in percentage of the maximum, they say you have a full mystical experience. And now, so we know that psychedelics can induce mystical experiences. So what does the research actually say? So in one very influential study, they found that 60% of subjects had mystical experiences using the criteria I just described. And here are some statistics from that study. So at 2 months after and 14 months after, over 50% of participants rated it among the top 5 most personally meaningful experiences of their life. So that's like in the same category of your first child or your wedding and stuff like this. So it's really quite crazy for people to rate it that high. And also top 5 spiritually significant, and same percentage reported increased personal well-being and life satisfaction. Again, this is 2 months and 14 months out. So even over a year later, people are still saying this. And positive behavior change. They also note it in themselves and also other people noting it in them. So this is like a testament to how powerful these experiences are for people. That even 14 months later, they're saying they still rate it as highly significant and say it had a number of positive impacts on them. Again, it says 1 or 2 experiences they had. And another thing, it actually changes their personality in a particular domain called openness to experience. And this is a personality domain that's associated with your ability to entertain alternate viewpoints, have new experiences, also how creative you are, and how much aesthetic appreciation you have for things. And this increases the more you have a mystical experience, according to a couple studies, actually. So there seem to be a number of positive effects from having mystical experiences with psychedelics. Here's some reports of people in the studies, because these are, I've been showing you stats, quantitative stuff, but what are they actually saying? So they asked a bunch of people from one of these studies, what was the most memorable and spiritually significant, from this experience? So one person was like, freedom from every conceivable thing, including time, space, relationship, self. It was as if the embodied me experienced ultimate transcendence, even of myself. Another person, that in every horrible experience or frightening experience, if you stay with it, enter into it, you will find God. That the horror is in reality only an illusion, and God lies beneath it all. It has become a guiding principle in my life. The part that continues to stick with me was knowing, seeing, and experiencing with every sense and fiber of my being that all things are connected. So this is quite, powerful stuff. These are big statements for people to make. Yeah, so that was in terms of what was most memorable, and this is in terms of what changed after they experienced. And increased in commitment to spiritual practices. My heart is more open, more aware of choices, better boundaries, and personal relationships. Relating better in your marriage with more empathy, less judging of myself. Take more time in nature and art. I feel closer to children and parents, more comfortable with others, more committed to my career. And as you can see, this is a very beautiful set of changes that people have from these experiences. Then to go back into the quantitative stuff, Clinical trials with psychedelics using them to treat certain disorders have found correlations between the mystical experience and positive outcomes. So in this one, this is reduction in depression symptoms and scores on oceanic boundlessness, which is a way of measuring ego dissolution. You see a significant correlation. The more they had ego dissolution, the more they had less depression symptoms. Similar with how much they're smoking. People who want to quit tobacco, and this is a change in craving. So craving was significantly lower for people who had more of a mystical experience. So this is a sample. There's a number of other studies too showing how quantitatively these mystical experiences are associated with better outcomes. And here are some more reports. Last time I was showing you reports of people who were healthy and had a mystical experience. This is in people who are being treated for treatment-resistant depression. So these are people who have had moderate to severe depression for many years, sometimes over decades, where no treatment really worked for them up until then. And they had an experience during psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy with psilocybin, and this is what some of the stuff they were saying. So one person was like, I got a wider perspective. I stepped back. It helped me appreciate that the world is a big place and there's a lot more going on than just the minor things that were going on in my head. Another person, before I enjoyed nature, now I feel a part of it. Before I was looking at it as a thing, like a TV or a painting. You're a part of it. There's no separation or distinction. You are it. I was everybody, unity, one life with 6 billion faces. I was the one asking for love and giving love. I was swimming in the sea and the sea was me. That's a nice one. And not all people attribute it to God. People have their own interpretations. It could be a connection with the universe, or with nature, or with Gaia, or what have you. But some people do use the phrase, the languaging, you could say, of God. So this person was like, I experienced the presence of God, not God in some dogmatic way, but a godlike archetype within your psyche that is real and within you. I know this exists. I directly experienced it. I was with my eyes and mouth wide open, completely in a state of awe and ecstasy. Sounds quite nice, right? And then another study, actually a last study that I want to cover here before I open up for questions, is a cool study where they gave psilocybin to meditators on day 4 of a 7-day intensive mindfulness retreat. It's actually a Vipassana retreat for those who are familiar with it. And they found that people who received psilocybin had significantly more ego dissolution, spiritual type experiences. So this OSB stands for oceanic boundlessness. It's a sense of boundlessness and unity of all things and expansiveness of their identity. And obviously it goes way up, as does this one, which is visual restructuralization, which is just seeing shapes and colors and images. And this is also changes in vigilance, which is less important here. But people had much more of these experiences, as you'd expect, while on this meditation retreat. What's interesting, when they measured them weeks after they got back from the retreat, people who had higher oceanic boundlessness during the retreat had much more positive effects. And these were the people who received psilocybin. So them having psilocybin on their meditation retreat made them have more ego dissolution experiences, which then weeks after led to more positive benefits. Not only that, if you measure the brains of these people, there are 2 core regions of the default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex here in red and the posterior cingulate in blue. The more they became less connected, the more they got reduced in their connection to each other, the more people had the experience of ego dissolution. So not only does having the experience of ego dissolution lead to more lasting positive benefits, but actually it also leads to brain changes. And again, this is weeks after the retreat. So there seems to be long-term, it seems to be the case that psychedelics, and psilocybin in this case, synergizes with meditation, helps people have deeper mystical ego dissolution type experiences, which then weeks after had a lasting positive benefit, which is some very powerful stuff and very important to acknowledge, and shows a lot of potential here to synergize with meditation, again, when used in the right way, in the right context, etc. So So that's mainly that covers the content. So some general conclusions is that, as we've seen, psychedelics can dissolve our sense of ego or self and lead to mystical experiences or feelings of connectedness to others and the universe as a whole. And this experience then leads to significant shifts in life perspective, improvements in well-being, and reduced symptoms in patient populations. And also, we saw how the brain basis of these effects is complex and involves multiple networks. It's not just the D4 network, as you might hear a lot. And finally, psychedelics may synergize with meditation to catalyze spiritual experiences with lasting benefits. So showing a lot of potential there to help people who are on their own spiritual path or engaging with these kinds of practices. And that's it. As the last thing, a little shameless plug. I do have a YouTube channel where I talk about the research of psychedelics in a way that anybody can understand, but that's not superficial, kind of like what I tried to do today. So definitely check me out, The Psychedelic Scientist. I'm also on Instagram, which many of you might know because you might have seen this event on Instagram. But in any case, check it out if you're interested. And with that, here's some of the main references. And yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much. So if you go back to the blackboard thing, you can see the questions in the chat. Oh.
Yes, awesome.
So there's some questions I'm guessing they're gonna start throwing at you now, but there's also questions that people left when they were signing up, so I can start with that to break the ice.
Mm-hmm.
So
for sure.
Yeah, one of the things that popped up was microdosing. Are there good studies? Does it work? Is it more of a scam? We've had different opinions. What's your opinion?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we stick with the research, a lot of it does suggest that the effects are mainly placebo. In that, you know, some of the largest studies conducted to date, they found that microdosing did increase measures of well-being and some intention and cognitive measures, but so did the group in that study who thought they received microdoses but didn't, and which suggests a lot of it is due to positive expectation effects and placebo effects. But that said, there are other studies showing that small doses of psychedelics, such as LSD, can increase neuroplasticity in the brain, which could potentially help people with forming new habits or changing the way they think about certain things, or getting rid of bad habits, and so on. And so far, we're in the very early stages of research, so we don't really know how effective it is and whether it is over and above placebo. But research does suggest that, you know, people are very bad at judging how it does affect them and whether it does, and a lot more work is needed to tease it apart from being just placebo. I personally think a lot of the effects might be placebo, but at the end of the day, that's not a bad thing. You're still getting a benefit. And I think, but over and above that, I think microdosing is most effective when you combine it with something else. When you combine it with committing to a meditation practice or a yoga practice or a journaling practice or whatever practice. So I think in that case, it can help you along that practice. But I think just microdosing and not doing anything with it, maybe that would be mostly placebo or won't really help that much. Cool. It's okay. I'm seeing in the chat, you know, I'll just read it out loud. You said that, for example, psilocybin reduces your parahippocampus activity. Does it have an effect on how you remember things? Yes, very likely. I think, for example, you know, the parahippocampus activity and connectivity that I mentioned was specifically what correlated with ego dissolution experiences. And if you're really having an ego dissolution experience, there's no you to be remembering something, you know, so your relationship to your memory is very different in that state. You might even forget who you are or where you are and forget everything about yourself. that happens at higher doses in ego dissolution. So I think, yes, psychedelics definitely have an effect on how you remember things, but it really depends on the intensity of your experience. And in this case, if you're in an ego death experience, you very well, will not be able to remember the details of it. You'll just remember that it happened. No problem.
Well, then another question that popped up was how you got into studying the psychedelics, like before your PhD and now when doing your PhD. What made you get into that field?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I got interested in psychedelics through initially an interest in meditation and Eastern spirituality and these kinds of things, Buddhism, etc., yoga, and came across some really well-written books. For example, a book called LSD Doorway to the Numinous by the Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof. And this is an amazing book, very comprehensive, goes into a lot of detail on the different types of LSD experiences he encountered over his multi-decade career, where he took part in like thousands of sessions of LSD psychotherapy. And I found it fascinating, and then, got into undergrad, for example, studied philosophy and psychology and this kind of thing, and eventually ended up volunteering in a cognitive neuroscience lab that was doing research related to daydreaming, mind-wandering meditation. And yeah, and I just use that as a way to build experience and then pursue later on psychedelics, because it's very much related to these concepts.
Okay, that's great. And then another thing, well, I'm not sure what the state is in Canada, but what's your view on like legalizing? Yeah, that was what I was gonna ask. So what's like the legal status of working with psychedelics in the lab, and your view in general about legalizing psychedelics and other soft drugs?
Yeah. So definitely, in order to obtain it for research, you do have to you have to go through. Here in Canada, it's Health Canada. In the States, it's the FDA. I'm not sure what it is elsewhere. There's just a lot of regulations and things. You have to describe how safe it is. You have to get very pure molecule done in research grade labs. And basically, you have to jump through a lot of hoops to make it possible. But it is possible to access them for research. In terms of people getting it outside research, it is still, they're illegal here in Canada, as in most of North America, except for a number of states in the US, for example. And I believe in Spain and elsewhere, they're also being decriminalized, so you can possess them and not be charged. But a lot of people think, and very likely it will be the case, that MDMA, for example, and psilocybin will be available to psychiatrists, and people will be able to go to clinics and centers and get treatments with them within the next 3 to 5 years. It's a very fast-moving space. There's a lot of research being done, very promising. And if everything moves along as it has, by potentially even 2025, these things are going to be start being accessible, and at least in North America. I guess I can answer Bautista's question here.
Yeah.
It's how great is the rate of psychosis triggered by psychedelics? Are there records of it happening? Actually, well, the thing with that is, well, first of all, it's extremely low, like less than 1%. And in no controlled study has anybody gone into a lasting psychosis. But this is also because they screen people. So people who have a family history of schizophrenia, or who have had a psychotic break in the past, don't get into studies because it's just too risky. Although in the future, researchers are considering including this population because it could be helpful for them, potentially at smaller doses. But if anybody in your family has schizophrenia or a history of psychosis or even bipolar disorder, you have to be very, very careful because it can put you in weird headspaces. And I think for specific people who are going to develop psychosis at some point in their life anyway, it could speed that up. That's the main thing. But if you're nobody in your family that you know of has ever had schizophrenia, you've never had any type of stuff in your life, it's not going to induce psychosis in you out of nothing. That just doesn't happen, and that's kind of like a myth around psychedelics. And then Mika's asking, what makes psychedelics have lasting effects, yet it doesn't make an addictive substance like other drugs? One way it's different than hard drugs such as cocaine or heroin or whatever else is that those work mainly on the dopamine system in your brain. So they basically hijack your brain's reward system, make you feel really good, and teach your brain that this was really good, you should do it again. And that's what happens with these drugs. Where psychedelics don't target the dopamine system. They don't activate your reward system in the same way these other drugs do. So they don't lead to that kind of addictions where you just want to do it over and over again. And even how this is studied a lot of times is mice. If you give mice the availability of cocaine, they'll keep taking it over and over and over again because they love it. If you put psychedelics in there, they'll take it a couple of times and they'll stay away from it. Like, I'm good, I don't want that anymore. And that suggests on a very basic level, they're just not addiction-forming substances. And the lasting effects they have are not on the reward system, but in aspects of your cortex related to how you think and how you perceive the world and other behaviors, not necessarily trying to seek out something that was good. No problem. And then Gabriel, are there any current studies on how to induce ego dissolution states with a non-invasive treatment, like I mentioned, can be done for out-of-body experiences? That would be fascinating, but nothing that we know of. I think it's partially because ego dissolution experiences are much more complex, and as we've seen in my presentation, it seems that memory regions such as the hippocampus and parahippocampus are involved, but these are very deep towards the middle of your brain, and you can't stimulate them non-invasively. They're just too deep to do that. So there's nothing that I know of that can do that. But of course, you could potentially have ego dissolution experiences through very, very deep meditation, even breath work, sensory deprivation, being in a sensory deprivation tank, and other experiences. Being in awe in a very beautiful environment can potentially trigger that kind of experience. So it is possible, but in terms of stimulating the brain in some way, not that I know of. I'll just continue. So BNSA says, what do you think about the Stone Ape theory and if ego dissolution can relate to human evolution? This is an interesting question. So I think what's interesting is there's a research paper that came out this year showing that activating the serotonin 2A receptor, which psychedelics hit, in a developing brain, stimulates the development of more brain cells, essentially. That's the simplistic way to say it, but it makes brain cells proliferate, and it makes many more of them grow, and that might actually relate to the expansion of cortex we see in humans, where our cortex is much larger than chimpanzees and other primates. And so there is actually very recent research showing that the receptor might actually play a role in the development of our brain, and that's the most grounded, concrete research that has shown that. And actually, I could share that I'm working on a paper with Robin Carhart-Harris, the leading psychedelic researcher, and a couple others, kind of arguing and describing this, how psychedelics and the 2A receptor might have played a role in evolution and the expansion of the cortex. So that's something. It's a paper we're writing, and it probably won't be out for another year or something because we've just started kind of writing it. But it's something people are exploring. But I think in terms of Terence McKenna and how he initially described it, I don't think, he said a lot of stuff that just wasn't true and didn't hold up under evidence. So I think if a version of the Stone Ape hypothesis is true, it's not necessarily that, primates earlier in evolution found them because it helped them hunt, and this helped them eventually gain language and all these things. It might not necessarily be like that, but there is some link between the way psychedelics work in the brain and the processes that made our brain expand. So yeah, be on the lookout for that paper in the next year or two, probably a year. And next question, Miguel, do you know if cannabis triggers the reward system in the same way? It doesn't, no. It doesn't do it nearly as potently as these other other drugs, like hard drugs, which I would say is like heroin, meth, cocaine, these things which will really, can quite easily make you addicted. But trying them won't necessarily definitely make you addicted, but there's high addictive potential. So I think cannabis, in my understanding, affects the dopamine system definitely more than psychedelics, but not in the same way or to the same extent of these highly addictive drugs. That's why a lot of people, debate whether cannabis is addictive or not. But often the way it's addictive is more of a psychological dependence than it being kind of hard-coded in your brain because of the reward system. So it's a slightly different type of addiction that can happen that's not the same, and it's perhaps not as harsh on your brain as the other drugs. No problem.
Any other question, guys? No, I think we can leave it off of that. Thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure, for sure. Happy to share the stuff. Always happy to answer questions.
We'll keep an eye out for your next paper. We'll share it to anyone who subscribed to this talk a year or so from now.
For sure. Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. Truly my pleasure. Yeah, Miguel, I will. Once that paper comes out and we've ironed it out, I'll definitely make a video. So if you stay up with my YouTube channel, you will see, for sure.